So, what is Tholonia? In a nutshell, the Tholonic model is based on the following claims. Everything is energy. That's a pretty basic, provable statement. Energy is awareness and intention. Now, that is a wild statement. And by energy in this case, we're talking about real energy, joules, the power of the sun, the energy that keeps planets moving. Actual, real, measurable energy is a form of awareness and intention. The details that explain exactly how that statement can be made, we'll get into a little deeper later on. However, if everything is energy, and energy is awareness and intention, then everything is awareness and intention. Awareness and intention are properties of existence. We could just as easily say energy is a property of existence, and that would be 100% true. When we refer to awareness further on, or whenever we refer to awareness, the concept of intention is implied. Just like when we refer to electricity, the concept of magnetism is implied, because the two can only exist together. Awareness always implies intention, and intention always implies awareness. That's a Tholonic axiom. Consciousness is a contextually relevant instance of awareness. So we think of awareness, in this case, like an archetype. Consciousness is an instance of that archetype. So the consciousness within an animal, within a human, within a planet, are all going to be different because they have very different contexts. And if consciousness or awareness is a property of existence, then everything that exists has some instance of awareness. Intelligence refers to the ability to problem solve, to learn, and to apply creativity, which are properties that nature and the universe demonstrate with flying colors. The Tholonic claim is that intelligence, at least on how we are defining it, results from the interaction between instances of awareness. We see a basic example of this in the idea of semantics, as in the semantic web. In this context of semantics, there's always a triplet of information: a subject, an object, and a predicate. So in this example, Bob is the subject, the object is the Mona Lisa, and the predicate or relationship between the two is interested in. The subject and the object here are instances, Bob and the Mona Lisa. They exist. The predicate of is interested in is a result of the interaction between these two instances. So it is a primitive form of intelligence created by the interaction between the instances. There's also the triplet of Alice is a friend of Bob, and Mona Lisa was created by Leonardo da Vinci. So those are three different triplets made up of subject, object, predicate. With these three triplets, we've created another triplet. Let's call it a meta-triplet, which is the relationship between Alice and Leonardo da Vinci. But now the relationship between them isn't just a simple predicate like is interested in or was created by. It's actually another triplet. This triplet is telling us that something related to Alice has some relationship with something related to Leonardo da Vinci. It's pretty vague. But as we drill down into child triplets, we obviously expose the details. And as we have more embedded layers of interaction, we have a more sophisticated, evolved form of intelligence. And that's exactly how the semantic web works, because there are databases that hold billions and trillions of these triplets. and then it can form relationships between them very quickly and discover information that would otherwise remain unknown. What these triplets form are objects of information. It has taken data, which is Alice, is a piece of data, Bob is a piece of data, is a friend of is a piece of data, and to form them into a relationship that can be called information. When we combine these information objects together, we actually can create what is essentially an object of knowledge. We know something now that we didn't know before. The relationship between Alice and Leonardo da Vinci in this example. And it's these multidimensional layers of embedded knowledge and information which resulted from the interaction between the two instances is what forms the basis of intelligence. And as the instances are instances of awareness, it is the interaction of awareness that creates intelligence. Therefore, anything that exists, which is an instance of awareness, has some form of intelligence. Obviously, in the real world, it has much more practical applications, and some of them slightly nefarious as well, unfortunately. There are 4 contexts in which energy instantiates, at least in this case. There's the 3-dimensional context, which is matter, atoms, elements. They are energy in material form. There's the 2-dimensional context, which is waves and radiation, like the electromagnetic spectrum. And contrary to what might be intuitively obvious, electromagnetic waves are 2-dimensional, or at least can be 2-dimensional. Of course, when you have more than one of them, you have something that's 3-dimensional. Take the example of electricity and magnetism. Both of them can be represented as 2-dimensional waves, but they're perpendicular to each other. So we have 2 perpendicular 2-dimensional waves, hence a 3-dimensional phenomena. But the waves itself can be 2-dimensional. There's also the 1-dimensional context of energy, and that would be represented by a quanta of energy, or a photon, but a moving photon. The photon, which represents the basic building block of energy, of reality, always moves in one direction and always at one speed, the speed of light. A photon that is not moving is a 0-dimensional point. A point, which has to be 0-dimensional by definition, has no dimensions and has no properties except for the properties of awareness and intention, simply based on the idea that the concept of a point can only exist if there is an intention to have such a concept. And to have such a concept, there has to be an awareness to have the intention. So a 0-dimensional point has only the properties of awareness and intention. Therefore, where there is energy, there is consciousness. And wherever there is consciousness, there is intelligence. Consequently, reality on all dimensions is filled with various contextual instances of awareness and various forms of intelligence. The laws of energy are contextual instances of the laws of awareness. So the laws that we understand, laws of reality and how things work, are contextual to the spectrum of reality that we live within. Tholonia attempts to model the laws of awareness based on our knowledge of the existing laws of the instances of awareness that we have learned about. In other words, reality as we know it. In applying this model, we discover that all understanding, all processes, across all time and across all that exists, follow the same fundamental rules. And this applies not only to nature, math, electricity, psychology, society, etc., but to realities, dimensions and life forms not yet known or recognized by science, which the Tholonic model explores in depth, or at least as deep as it can at this point. The Tholonic model also proposes the idea of another type of energy that is not easily detected in our three-dimensional world, but is as important to existence as matter and light. Perhaps it's a four-dimensional context of energy. Don't know. Think of it like this. This new form of energy is to the electromagnetic spectrum what the electromagnetic spectrum is to the material spectrum. And by material spectrum, I'm referring to the 118 elements of the periodic table. The elements, the points, the building bricks of the physical reality. That's the material spectrum. The book, Tholonia, explores, describes, and explains these ideas to some degree in more detail. The Tholonic model is mostly a mountain of questions based on an unproven and barely testable hypothesis. Some tests have been encouraging, and the point of the Tholonia project is to refine, develop, or eliminate various Tholonic claims. To do that, the project needs knowledgeable people in almost every field of study, not just the classics, such as biology, math, physics, chemistry, etc., but also metaphysical areas, such as adepts in out-of-body experiences, experts in mythology and comparative religions, psychologists and parapsychologists, artists, and really any other discipline where the practitioner is looking for answers that can only be found outside our current paradigm of reality. The Tholonic model, being a model, is a way to understand things, and not necessarily the reality of how things exist or how things function. A good example of this is how we use the nested grid model to predict the weather. In that model, there are grids within grids within grids. Each one of the elements of those grids, patterns are determined, and then they're aggregated into the larger grids, etc., etc. That doesn't mean that is the way weather actually works. It just means that this is how we have come to understand the weather. The basic form of the Tholonic model is the tetrahedron, mainly because it is the simplest shape that can exist in 3 dimensions. We can actually say there's a more basic form, which is the triangle, which is the simplest shape that can exist in 2 dimensions. And there is a 2-dimensional version of the thologram because we can map the tetrahedron to a 2-dimensional shape. Of course, this isn't the case for the 1-dimensional or the 0-dimensional. However, the 0-dimensional point actually contains the most information of all. But getting into that is beyond the scope of this intro. It's the 3-dimensional shape that is most applicable to our reality. But it's a fractal 3-dimensional tetrahedron. I guess we could say it's verging on a 4-dimensional or a multi-dimensional tetrahedron. So as we explore these laws of energy, laws of awareness, we apply them to the tetrahedron. And we build out the tetrahedron in a fractal manner to create what we call the thologram, which is essentially a tetrahedron which has an infinite number of embedded self-similar children. So we actually start out with one shape. that expands inward. This inward expansion of children tetrahedrons from parent tetrahedrons happens organically and naturally, which is explained in detail in the book, and each tetrahedron represents a organization of energy and therefore some instance of intelligence, some instance of consciousness. An interesting side note is if you expand the tetrahedron outward instead of inward and use the points as a center of a circle, you end up with a design called the Flower of Life, which is a very ancient design, originally found on the Temple of Osiris 6,000 years ago, that was meant to describe or illustrate the organization of the universe, of the structure of reality. The thologram is the same thing, but inward and in 3 dimensions. So you've got this hierarchical grid of awareness as it's divided into smaller and smaller instances represented as tetrahedrons, with each tetrahedron having different types of interactions with its parents, its children, and its peers. Now, even though we're talking about something that's hierarchical, it is not a hierarchy of importance. Of course, there is a hierarchy of power, as the larger tholons have more power over the children in that they define the direction of the children. But the hierarchy of importance is equal, just as the smaller gears in a watch are just as important as the larger gears in the watch. If the small ones don't work, the watch doesn't work. This hierarchy is actually called a holarchy, and it was developed, or the basics of it was developed back in 1972 by Ervin Laszlo, who was a philosopher, theorist, 2-time Nobel Prize nominee, and who wrote a book called Evolutionary Systems Theory, Introduction to Systems Philosophy, toward a new paradigm of contemporary thought. In that book, he incorporates what he calls the living systems theory. And the hierarchical structures, which he also incorporated, come from Mario Bunge, who was an Argentine philosopher and physicist and considered a giant in the field of semantics, ontology, epistemology, philosophy of science, and ethics, and recipient of 21 honorary doctorates and 4 honorary professorships by universities in the Americas and in Europe. So this is a very well thought out hierarchy. Now, the reason they built this hierarchy in the first place was because they were trying to provide a framework for understanding universal structures that span the scopes, ranging from subatomic physics, biology, chemistry, organisms, and social systems, all the way to the cosmos, black holes, galaxies, etc. Laszlo described this hierarchy as a model of interconnected conceptual entities, which is really important that they're conceptual entities, because it is concepts that define how we understand how things work. The concepts may not be, quote unquote, the reality of whatever it is we're describing, but it's a concept that works. So this holarchy is a model of interconnected conceptual entities. When one of these entities is acting as a part of a larger entity or a larger concept, it's called a parton. And when acting as a whole entity with its own parts, or partons, it's called a holon. The holon represents the wholeness of its nature, and the parton represents an integrated part of the greater holon. The hierarchical ordering of holons and partons is called the holarchy. An example of this would be a simple biological cell. The transcoder within the cell and other components necessary for the cell to function would be considered partons. Likewise, the transcoder is also a holon with its own component partons, and the cell itself is a parton to, say, an organ. This makes the holarchy fractal in nature, and the structure of the entire hierarchy is self-replicated in each holon. This holarchy was meant to be a map of all concepts, all archetypes that we have collected. And it was an attempt to organize these concepts in a hierarchical fashion where each parton is a child of a holon. The map, the holarchic map, is essentially two-dimensional. What we've done here is we've taken this two-dimensional holarchic map and applied it three-dimensionally. And that's where the tetrahedron comes in. So it's a three-dimensional tetrahedral holarchic map. And that's where the word Tholonia comes from. Tetrahedral holon. The IA at the end of the word Tholonia is the suffix that just represents the plurality, because we're talking about an effectively infinite number of tetrahedrons within tetrahedrons. Hence the word Tholonia, an infinite number of tetrahedral holons. Okay, this intro video was originally meant to be like a 5-minute video. And I tried to put all the basic stuff up front. Then I got a little more into it. If you're still listening, I want to elaborate just a bit on one of the most fundamental parts of the model itself. And that is the concept that a piece of knowledge must adhere to the laws that are defined by a tetrahedron, which at first may not make any sense because we're talking about knowledge versus geometry. But it does make sense when we begin to apply the laws of geometry, which are, like all of the laws, whether they're mathematical, physics, or otherwise, instances of energy, instances of awareness. When we apply those same laws of geometry in other contexts, we see that there is a pattern of, I guess we could call it a dependency for something to instantiate. A more real-world, three-dimensional, practical example would be the concept of electricity. We have ohms, volts, and amps. Those are the three basic components of an electric current. And an electric current can't exist without all three of those things. There is the superconducting materials that can bring resistance close to zero, but absolute zero resistance, for example, is not possible. There's always going to be some element of each of those three in an electrical current. And this raises actually a really important point that is often overlooked when we generally think about the laws of the universe and the laws of science. In the case of electrical current, if resistance actually was absolutely zero, then the current would have to be infinite, which of course is not possible. The reality is, Ohm's law, which is the general law that describes the relationship between current, voltage, and resistance, only works in a particular scope, a particular range of reality, not at absolute zero or not at extreme temperatures. We see the same thing with Newton's laws. Newton's laws work fine for normal, quote-unquote, reality. But as we start moving faster towards the speed of light or extreme conditions, heat or cold, Newton's law doesn't work. And that's where things like relativity and quantum gravity have to come in and take over. So imagine a bell curve where the two endpoints of the bell curve are like the extreme conditions of reality. The middle, which is where we exist most of the time and where most things actually exist, because it represents the balance of the two forces, the most compatible, the most efficient integration of those two forces. Most things live there. They're at the peak of the bell curve. Reality at the peak of the bell curve is different than at the extremes, and the laws and rules that can predict how that reality works only work in that particular range. When you go out to the extremes, the laws change. And in fact, for the example of Ohm's law, it's not really a law at all. It's more like a what happens most of the time rule. And really that applies to the Newtonian, second laws of motion, that sort of thing. It only applies in a particular context, a particular scope. As the scope changes, the laws change. So when we are talking about an electric current, which is electricity in action, we're actually talking about three different properties that are working together to form that pattern of an electric current. And in fact, there's really a fourth, because with those three values, you can determine a fourth value. The fourth value is power, or watts. So we have three basic elements that create a fourth. Any of those three can create the fourth. So we have 4 points that define a concept. Concept is electricity. The 4 points are those 4 different aspects of electricity. Well, those 4 points happen to map very neatly onto the 4 points of a tetrahedron. So we can apply this to energy and E equals mc squared. We can apply this to society, ethics, laws, and power. We can even apply it to pi and the 4 distinct elements that composes pi. We can apply it to simple math, to the laws of motion, to psychology. And according to the Tholonic model, we could apply it to anything that exists. And by anything, that includes concepts, theories, ideas, dreams, you name it. Because this law applies to anything that has the stability to exist. Whatever organization of energy that creates a stable pattern, for lack of a better description, has to adhere to that rule, where there are the elements that create an instance where all 4 of these properties have to exist with each other compatibly to maintain sustainability and stability. In the holarchic model, there is such a thing called the law of holarchies. And that law is a holon always looks up to its parents for what it needs to integrate, looks sideways for what it needs to complete and or cooperate with, and looks down for what it wants to control or command. That was the original definition of the law of holarchies. In the Tholonic model, it's a little different, where a holon always contributes upwards, always negotiates sideways with its peers, and always defines below. So it's a slightly more holistic concept. However, the negotiation aspect is not always one of peace and harmony. Sometimes negotiation, at least in the Tholonic model, requires a battle. Sometimes there's conflict, and the negotiation is who wins. So you've got conflict, you've got cooperative, synergetic relationships, you've got a number of different ways that ultimately have to come to a negotiated balance. So the 4 parton elements that define a holonic concept have to exist with each other in a way that is sustainable. Otherwise, the holonic concept could not exist. Therefore, the Tholonic claim is anything that exists must have these 4 qualities, these 4 attributes, 4 elements, 4 partons that exist together through contribution, negotiation, and definition to create something that is an instance. It turns out that that very clearly seems to be the case. Even in the world of finance, like in the world of the stock market and trading, the Tholonic concepts apply. This Tholonic model of having 4 elements to create the Tholonic concept of a trade or a transaction completely holds up. Now, where it gets really interesting and strange is if all of that is true, we can say some other things that are pretty wild about existence, realities, intelligences, consciousness that are way outside the current paradigm, but hold up under the Tholonic scrutiny. And those are some of the things that we want to explore in the Tholonic project. One of the more advanced and also more interesting ideas is the concept that consciousness and gravity are 2 instances of the same thing in very different contexts. That might sound really metaphysical and esoteric. However, there's actually work on that. There's physicists, quantum physicists, who are looking at exactly this same concept, that consciousness and gravity are intrinsically related, so much so that some physicists have suggested that consciousness must be considered as one of the essential forces in nature, along with the 4 basic forces of the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity. There should be one more, some physicists say. Consciousness needs to be one of the basic forces of nature. On a more practical, day-to-day level, we've done some experiments using natural tetrahedral structures. The idea that a tetrahedral matrix would be the simplest and most efficient and most fundamental manner in which to distribute energy. And coincidentally, one of the most important elements for life itself happens to be tetrahedral in nature, and that's water. It was only as recent as 2013 that they proved that the water molecule was tetrahedral in structure, but the theory goes back at least 100 years. This discovery clearly makes water the tetrahedral matrix that all life depends on. So if we were looking for the ideal test medium, water is a really good candidate. And some of the tests we've done have had pretty astounding results. They're not 100% perfectly scientifically controlled, which is something that we would like to do, but what has been done so far has been impressive enough to look into it much further. So that's the Tholonic model in a nutshell.